Welcome to Wandering Jews at J Square Adventures. Travel far enough and you meet yourself.
We're your hosts. I'm Scott.
And I'm Sorel. When you are on vacation or even in your hometown, how often do you pay attention to the names of the streets? And perhaps even possibly consider the stories behind them. According to Mapping Diversity, a project that analyzes representation in street names across 17 European countries, more than 1/3, that's nearly 53,000, were named after people. 90% of them, you may not be surprised to hear, were named after men, and only 10% were named after women. Now, some cities do better than others, but even the top three, Stockholm, Copenhagen, and Berlin, don't even get close to 50-50.
And that question of paying attention to where we are, what's around us, in some ways that's part of the beauty of traveling. It's part of the beauty of visiting a place you don't know, of feeling that you're getting behind the scenes. Today on Wandering Jews, we're going to be going to the stories of famous Jewish women in Berlin, those who have been honored with street names, monuments, public squares, all across the city landscape. Some of the names you might be familiar, and if you've traveled to Berlin with J Squared Adventures, some of these places will be familiar because you've actually stood at the site. Rachel Varnhagen, who was a pioneer culturally, socially, the whole idea of the intellectual salon, gathering German literary and cultural stars, both Jewish and non-Jewish, in her home. Fanny Mendelssohn, a musical prodigy who hosted influential musical salons. Rosa Luxemburg, a key figure in communist activism in Germany in the period before the First World War, and the leader of a Marxist revolt in Germany during that period of upheaval. Hilda Radusch, an anti-fascist activist and LGBT icon from the early Nazi years. Regina Jonas, the first woman ordained as a rabbi who, among other things, ministered to prisoners and bolstered morale and cultural and religious, spiritual life in the Theresian camp and model ghetto that was established by the Nazis for Jewish prisoners in the Czech Republic. And Hannah Arendt, a renowned philosopher and political theorist, the first woman to be appointed a full professor at Princeton. And, of course, we have to mention the memorial to the Rosenstrasse protest, a protest that took place during February and early March 1943. Groups of non-Jewish women who went out to protest during the height of Nazi power against their husbands, Jewish men, who were threatened with deportation and execution, and it actually resulted in the release of their Jewish husbands. And these are only some of the places and some of the names that we'll touch on in Berlin as we're walking from street to street, from monument to monument, from garden to garden, from plaza to plaza, looking for, searching for these stories of diversity, of female empowerment, of creativity, and returning her story to history. Sorel, when you think about some of these female role models and the ones that you know, when you think about Berlin, imagine you could go to coffee with one of them.
Ooh, coffee.
You'd be sitting in a beautiful coffee shop not far from the Brandenburg Gate. You'd be people watching together. You'd be eating a nice apple strudel and a double espresso, which is always my go-to. Who would you want to sit with? Who grabs your attention?
Oh my gosh, can I cheat? Can I get two people?
You can, as long as you can pay for the coffee and the strudel, you're all set.
All right, so, okay. Streets named after women who played a role in history. The first two people who come to mind when I think about Jewish women in Berlin who made their mark and whose mark can still be felt till today, I would point to Rachel Varnhagen and Fanny Mendelssohn. It's interesting, the late 18th century, these two women found their voice. You're talking about street names. These two women found their voice and their artistic expression not in the public domain, but rather from the intimacy, from the coziness of their salon. The whole concept of salons as gathering places for discussion, for debate, sharing ideas for centuries. It was an opportunity for women within the kind of acceptable confines of domestic life to find an outlet for their creativity, for their talent. And what I find so fascinating, if I can turn to Fanny Mendelssohn, who's sitting on my left drinking coffee next to me, Fanny Mendelssohn, who was actually the granddaughter of the famous Moses Mendelssohn, the Jewish theologian and philosopher, widely considered to be the father of the Jewish Enlightenment. She was a remarkable composer and pianist in the early 19th century. Her brother Felix actually was a musician who he dominated the public eye, but being a woman, she was, like all women around her in that time, was expected to conform to societal expectations and focus on her domestic role. So what did she do? Like so many of her counterparts who were tapping into the power of the salon in the inside domain as an opportunity to express themselves and to gather with people from all different echelons and all different backgrounds and literary figures, she would perform as a musician in the context of a salon her most impressive pieces. And honestly, that was like incredible to me that she was able to use the salon as a platform for her voice. And similarly, if we think about Rachel Varnhagen, like I think she was actually, in the late 18th century, she was considered the pioneer of this whole idea of bringing to Berlin the whole salon experience as a central gathering for the stars of German literary cultural life. So Fanny, she was a musician. For Rachel Varnhagen, she very much focused, I believe, on letter writing and literature. And if you think about those two as Jews, both Fanny and Rachel has very complex, ambivalent, questions of identity. We talked about Moses Mendelssohn being the father of the Enlightenment. So obviously with that whole trend of Enlightenment came some identity issues. But I found it very powerful that, we're talking about street names, but these women really made their mark, their indelible imprint within the salon. They were considered salonières. That was their opportunity to give voice to their talents.
Beautiful. No, and I think that it's interesting you chose two people who were both cultural entrepreneurs, I would say. Mm-hmm. Two people who also, as you say, had very complicated relations with their sense of who they were Jewishly, which I think was a huge part of the internal debate that was going on within the Jewish communities in Germany during the 19th century, and that individuals had to wrestle with. What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be German? How do I fit in? To what extent am I proud or embarrassed of being part of this downtrodden minority? And it goes without saying, these are questions that in different ways we continue to deal with today.
Beyond dealing with their Jewish identity, there's the gender imbalance as well. So, Scott, I'm going to turn the question back to you. Who would you most like to have coffee with?
Since I've already had coffee, I'll go for a small beer.
Nice.
Since we're in Germany, a small lager. In fact, Heinrich Heine, the Jewish German poet, he said the biggest contribution that the Jews made to German culture was the small beer. So I'm going to
love it.
I'm going to go with that. So if I had to invite someone to a small beer, I would definitely be with Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt's name goes before her. She was one of the greatest political theorists of the 20th century. She was someone who was extremely involved with her own internal discussion and the public discussion about what does it mean to be a Jew in modern times, and what does it mean for the Jews. Meaning for her, it wasn't just a question of individual identity, but it was the question of the Jewish people, of the Jews as an ethnic group, and also the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, under the auspices of the Zionist movement and what it meant to have a state of our own. Now, it's interesting also because Hannah Arendt, she is sometimes projected, I think, unfairly and incorrectly by voices on the left as a Jewish scholar, internationally known figure of great moral bearing, who was opposed to Jewish ethnicity, Jewish identity, Jewishness as a collective, and of course to Zionism. But we know that that just is not true. So, for example, Hannah Arendt, when she was forced to leave Germany, when the Nazis came to power, and she went to live in France, she worked for the World Zionist Organization, and she was, if I'm not mistaken, the deputy head of Youth Aliyah, helping children who would become refugees get to what was not yet the state of Israel, British-occupied Palestine, what we call in Hebrew the Yishuv, the settlement. In a lot of her writings, in the period before 1948, she very much talked about her dream that we would set up a bi-national state rather than a Jewish state. And so she joined people like Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, Henrietta Zold, who also were part of that same philosophical and political circles. Later, after living in Paris, Hannah Arendt immigrated to the United States, where she made her home in New York, becoming an American citizen in 1941. Again, she was the first woman to be appointed a professor at Princeton University. The breadth, the depth of who she was not only about Jewish issues, it was about the human experience in the 20th century, and her books on violence. Her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Yes, they dealt with Jewish issues, but many times they used Jewish issues to highlight questions about what does it mean to live politically? What does it mean to be a minority? And also, what are the responsibilities of the majority? And herself as a refugee, what does it mean to live in a century where political movements from the right, Nazism, and from the left, communism, have taken such enormous human tolls? How do we explain that we can have electricity in our homes, subways in our streets, computers, etc., but morally, politically, we're still caught up in the same insanities, and to some ways worse, than the human race had to face in centuries before the 20th. And so Hannah Arendt is just a fascinating figure. When we talk about her work, I'll just bring one quotation that struck me recently. We could go on and on about Hannah Arendt, and I promise you that I won't. But two interesting things about her. First and foremost, her famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil, talks about the famous Eichmann trial. Adolf Eichmann being captured by Israeli intelligence, brought to Jerusalem, and a trial, the Jewish people putting one of the central architects of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, on trial in Jerusalem. And Hannah Arendt's book was very, very controversial. In Hannah Arendt's description of, for example, the role of the Jewish councils during the Holocaust, she pointed a finger at those Jewish leaders who she claimed had collaborated with the Nazis in carrying out, in making possible the murder of the Jewish people. Her work was very influential, and many, many historians since that time have taken her work and tried to look at through different eyes what happened. Why did these Jewish councils exist? How did these various characters make their decisions? Were they only collaborators, or is the picture much more complicated?
When did she write the book?
It was published as a series of articles in the New York Review during the trial itself. She came to Jerusalem to cover the events.
Wow.
And the book was published as a book shortly afterwards.
So it really made waves.
Really made waves. But again, she was writing it very much out of a strong association with the Jewish people and things Jewish. The other piece, which I have to mention, is based on events going on in the world today. Her famous quote, "When one is attacked as a Jew, one must respond not as a German or a Frenchman or a world citizen, but as a Jew. And I think that even though she was, in many times of her life, not connected with the organized Jewish world and the Jewish community, this picture of her as being totally uncaring, unidentified, is absolutely wrong. She very much all throughout her life stood for a strong sense of Jewish dignity and integrity, both for the Jewish individual, but also for the Jews as a collective. So definitely to sit with Hannah Arendt and ask her, hey, Hannah, 2024, what would you say about the state of Israel, about Jews outside of Israel, about the state of the world, about politics, Hungary, Poland, the United States? Wow, that would be a fascinating conversation.
I want to be a fly on the wall in that conversation.
We'd probably need not just a small glass. We'd probably need a few small glasses.
It might be a meal.
But we'll see.
So today, Scott, you and I have touched upon describing some really incredible Jewish women in Berlin who, if you look at Berlin's city landscape, you can see them in street names, in monuments. They've been recognized in the public domain. And it's really an opportunity to, wherever you are, to become attuned and to think about the street names, the people behind them, and especially look out because there might be some really incredible women on your front doorstep. And think about who you would like to grab a coffee with, to talk to, and to really have a conversation. Right now, we are recording on a studio that is on Rivka Street. So apropos, that couldn't be more pertinent.
Definitely. When one of the women that we mentioned who we didn't dive into was Regina Jonas, the first woman rabbi, taught in Germany, was incarcerated in Theresen, and continued her work there as a teacher and a moral figure, upholding community and the spiritual life of the Jews who were prisoners in Theresen. There's a recent book, which I'll recommend, called As a Burning Flame, The Dream of Regina Jonas. It's by Noah Mishkin, and I think it's a nice way to continue your own journey with some of these famous Jewish women, whether it's Rachel Varnhagen, whether it's Fanny Mendelssohn, whether it's Hannah Arendt, or whether it's Regina Jonas. Go and find your own. And it could be when you come to Berlin with J Squared Adventures. It could be in the other cities and countries that we travel to with you, or it could be in your own backyard. It could be in your own community, in your own synagogue, maybe even in your own home. Remember that when you're checking out these street names, hopefully it's not only geographical pinpoints, they're also anchors of memory, but only when we stop to notice. And now, something for the road. A tip, a recommendation to help you make every journey your own.
And we're back with something for the road. We're staying in Berlin, and this week we have a central member, a founding member of the J Squared Squad, Sebastian van de Heuvel. Sebastian grew up in the Netherlands. He's been living in Israel for many years. He's our Chief Officer of Product and Innovation. Love working with Seb. Have loved getting to know him, and I'm really, really happy that he's with us this week. Seb, welcome.
Thank you. And it's an honor to be here. Already for many years at the company, also at the former company, many years in Jewish educational tourism. And it's just a very, very fun ride.
Besides work, maybe share, Seb, one or two things about yourself. Who are you outside of work?
Who am I outside of work? I live in Israel already since the end of the 90s. I've been there many times before that with different youth programs, and lived there with my two adult children and my wife and a dog in Jerusalem, with always challenges and always beauty. That is like for my life in Israel.
Excellent.
But also combined with Europe. I'm often in the Czech Republic, in Prague, in our office, and often in the Netherlands, my home country, original home country. And of course, today Israel is my home country. but sharing my time between the different worlds.
And those people who've had the pleasure of journeying with J Squid Adventures on Jewish heritage trips all throughout Europe and internationally. So Seb and his team in Prague, they're the ones that we all should be thanking for the really excellent and meaningful trips that they put together for all of us. So Seb, thanks to you and to the Prague team.
Thank you.
Let's dive right in. Seb, you're Berlin. Where are you going to take us?
Well, my Berlin is actually, for me, Berlin is always have been a very special place. My grandmother was born and partly raised in Berlin during the First World War. So we have family history there. I remember going there directly after the Berlin Wall went down and East Berlin was still gray and without all the tourist sites that you have today. So for me, it's always Berlin, and I go there every couple of years. Like every time we can go, we'll go there and visit Berlin. Just both, walking in the footsteps of my grandmother, and also just it's an amazing city. For me, actually, the favorite thing to do is just walking around on the streets and see all the different people. There's so many different sides to Berlin. But if I have to choose, I would start on, like, if you have a free afternoon or a late afternoon, I would start at the Brandenburger Gate. That was, of course, the big landmark. And I remember it standing there totally alone with a broken down wall, everything around it, without the monuments, without anything there. And just starting there today and see all the life that's there, the center of the modern German Republic. From there, walking across into Tiergarten, what is one of the biggest parks in Europe. It's not even a park. I would call it a wood. It's a forest, a forest with, like, the river crosses through there. There's all kind of canals and lakes. And just walking through there to see all the different monuments. And for me, it's also thinking, oh, my grandmother walked here, probably played here as a little girl. But also the other side that you can just see all of the history there. There's so many different monuments. Of course, it was already mentioned, this is the place, of course, where Rosa Luxemburg was murdered. And, that's the dark side of it. But the other side, it's a beautiful park. You have the Soviet monument there with their tanks, but it's very questionable in this moment, in these times, why it's still there, but it's there. Victory, monuments, different rulers, different intellectuals, it's all together there in one beautiful park. But you don't even have to look at it. Just look at the huge trees that regrow there since the Second World War. And like the war never happened. Just walking, sniffing in the fresh air in the middle of a big city. Then, when you follow the paths in the direction of the zoo, the Berlin Zoo, of course, also one of the landmarks of Europe, one of the oldest zoos, a very special place. And next to that, it's actually a building from the 1950s, what was built when rebuilding Western Berlin by the Americans, British, and France, that they were rebuilding this part of the city, the West Berlin, and they wanted to build a modern building, and they built two buildings, and the locals saw it, and they saw those buildings, and they said, oh, that looks like a bikini. Because remember, the bikini was just invented during that, in the 1950s. So they called it the Bikini Building, and that stick with it, and today it's called the Bikini Concept Mall. And I'm sure you can find a bikini there, but that is not the main thing of it. It's just a very cool place. It's aimed actually for the people in Berlin, less for tourists. Inside, you have a big courtyard with all kind of like little booths where you have pop-up shops with local artists, high-end shops. There are also some big international American brands there, but it's mainly still like the local Berliners. And my favorite places, what I try to go every time when I'm there, is just sit there in front of a huge window, and then you're looking over the Berlin Zoo. It's not even looking over the zoo. You're just looking directly into the Monkey Hill. But it is always, these baboons, when they're on that hill, it's like looking a little bit in the mirror of humankind. It's so fun to see them and to have, their anger issues, and they're playing around, and just have a cup of, they have excellent coffee there. And the Germans also are very good with their pastries. Just sit there, take it all in. And that is my real Berlin, and what I love about Berlin.
Excellent. A little bit of family memory, a little bit of public space, little bit of stretching your legs, a little bit of visiting, I'll call them cousins from the past, family maybe in a different way, the monkeys, baboons in the zoo. And as always, I hope that people who are visiting Berlin will take Seb up on his excellent tip, his recommendation. Get out there, walk around, discover the city, and that goes for everywhere we travel. Make it your own, tell your story, and get out there and explore. Seb, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll have other chances to have you back on Wandering Jews podcast.
Thanks for listening. Dive deeper into the world of travel on our J Squared Adventures website. That's j2adventures.com. And stay in the loop with our latest adventures on all our social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, all under J2 Adventures. And if you enjoyed hanging out with us, don't forget to leave us a comment, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, travel safely and keep wandering. I'm Sorrel.
I'm Scott.
See you soon with the Wandering Jews.